LinkedIn presents.
I'm Rufus Griscom, and this is The Next Big Idea. Today, what drives history? A conversation about dynamite, anarchy, and the future of creativity.
The bombs came in all kinds of packages.
That's Steven Johnson reading from the opening pages of his new book, The Infernal Machine.
Often they arrived in tin cans, emptied of the olive oil or soap or preserves the cans had originally been manufactured to contain, now wedged tight with sticks of dynamite, conveyed to their target location in a satchel or suitcase, accidentally left behind in the courthouse, or the train station, or the cathedral.
Steven is describing the 25-year period, 1895 to 1920, when there were 7,000 attempted bombings in New York City. That's right, 7,000. And who were the bombers?
Socialist agitators, Russian nihilists, Irish Republicans, German saboteurs. But of all the bomb throwers of the period, no group was more closely associated with the Infernal Machines, as the press came to call the bombs, than the Anarchists.
In an era when robber barons thought it perfectly reasonable to open fire on peaceful protesters who objected to a 72-hour work week, dynamite-loving anarchists dreamed of a future where egalitarian communities replaced brutal hierarchies. The best way to draw attention to their fantasy, they believed, was to commit horrendous acts of violence.
A new mythology arose among the young radicals, the propaganda of the deed. Mere words were not sufficient to incite revolutionary change. You needed an act of spectacular violence, directed at a well-known target. A strike dramatic enough to be picked up and amplified by the global media networks of the day.
Mail a bomb to an industrialist or plant a stick of dynamite on a congressman's doorstep, and you'd probably get front-page coverage in the nation's 2,000 daily newspapers.
Several books that I've written are narrative history books that are telling a true story from history that, hopefully has some contemporary relevance.
That's Steven talking with me last week about his broader body of work. So what's the contemporary relevance, you might ask, of the explosive intersection of dynamite and anarchy a century ago? Well, we live in a world where pundits on TV and guests around dinner tables are constantly talking about how polarized our nation is, more so than ever. Our institutions are fragile. Our future, we are told, is precarious. In contrast, the past feels solid, as if it could only have happened one way. But was it so? How delicate was the balance of human history in decades past? What drives historical change? Charismatic leaders, the evolution of technologies, contagious ideas? You might ask, why does it matter? Well, it's interesting for starters, and it's possible these questions may give us some insight into where we're headed, or at least some consolation that our current experience that the world is hanging by a thread is not new. Steven and I have been talking about these themes for a very long time. We've been friends since fourth grade. We went to college together. Back then, he wrote poetry and played bass in a band called The Lenny Kravitz. Now he's known as the author of 14 books and host of the PBS shows How We Got to Now and Extra Life. And in an unexpected plot twist, Steven recently began a new professional journey. He's currently helping Google build an AI tool called Notebook LM specifically for writers. We're going to get into all of this. His gripping new book, The Infernal Machine, about the creation of dynamite, the rise of anarchism, the development of the modern surveillance state, and how these phenomena drove one another. And more broadly, how history happens, what drives it, and what the past tells us about our present moment. And finally, how Steven writes, and how the tool he's building at Google can help us all write better and think better, too.
The LinkedIn Podcast Network is sponsored by TIAA. TIAA makes you a retirement promise, a promise of a guaranteed retirement paycheck for life. Learn more at TIAA.org/promises pay off.
Stephen Johnson, welcome back to The Next Big Idea.
Thank you, Rufus. It's always such a treat to be on this program.
Well, it's a treat to have you because we're going to do something unusual today. We're going to get to talk about a few different things in this conversation. We're going to talk about your latest book, The Infernal Machine. We're going to talk about how you write and think about the world and how your books reflect your worldview. And then we're going to talk about this new AI-powered tool for writers you're building at Google, Notebook LM, and the future of writing. So we have a poo-poo platter of interesting subjects here.
This is going to be like 9 hours long, isn't it? I'm so excited.
So here we go. Let's start with The Infernal Machine. The subtitle is A True Story of Dynamite, Terror, and the Rise of the Modern Detective. How is it, Stephen, that you alighted on this particular story, or we might say chose to weave together this collection of stories?
This one began with the history of crime and crime fighting. I had written this book, Enemy of All Mankind, about a pirate named Henry Every. It was the last history book I wrote, and I was interested in kind of staying in that space. And I started to think, like, maybe there's something about the history of forensics and the history of fingerprint technology. Like, how did those ideas come into the world? A lot of my writing is about innovation and new ideas and their roots. And so I started digging around in that and got interested in this period in New York where the NYPD was kind of modernizing in the early 20th century. And that led me to these crazy bomb campaigns that were going off during that period. And that led me to the anarchist movement that was so dominant in that period. And that led me back to the invention of dynamite, which was deployed by these anarchist groups during that period. And then at that point, I was like, now I'm starting to get something where I can actually have a big, broad tableau, but actually tell a kind of thrilling, page-turning story at the same time.
Well, as you know, I love this about your books, that the protagonists are not just colorful individuals, but also technologies, movements, ideas. And this is, in many ways, the most sort of deliciously complex of your historical narratives. Why don't we jump right into the story? You open the book with the story of Alfred Nobel. Most of us know Nobel as the founder of the Nobel Peace Prize, but his life calling was anything but peaceful. Can you tell us about Alfred?
Yeah, Nobel, as you say, most famous now for the prizes, but he made the money that endowed the prizes by inventing dynamite in the middle of the 19th century. He got very interested as a teenager, actually, in this new compound that had just been discovered, nitroglycerin. And nitroglycerin is actually, to this day, one of the most unstable and potent chemicals in the world. It had just been discovered about 10 years before, around 1846. And everybody up until Nobel who messed around with nitroglycerin regretted it. Like they either died or they lost a finger or, nearly killed themselves in the lab because you could just jostle a container of nitroglycerin and it would blow up. But Nobel had this idea that if you could somehow contain that power and trigger it in a reliable way and transport it in a way that didn't cause your transport vessel to explode, it would be a revolutionary advance. It would be, in fact, the single most significant advance in explosions since the invention of gunpowder. So that's a 1,000-year innovation, right? Like gunpowder dates back to, the first millennium. And his idea was not at all to use that power in the service of violence. His idea was to use it entirely in the service of engineering. He actually correctly predicted that this would be a seismic advance in how people could build skyscrapers or bridges or carve tunnels through mountains for railroads. I mean, just like all of the industrial engineering that was happening on such an epic scale at the end of the 19th century would be radically enhanced by having this explosive power. So he spent all this time trying to develop it. I mean, to kind of some would say, dangerous level. Like his younger brother was killed in an explosion in a lab that he'd built on his family property in Stockholm. So a different kind of entrepreneur at that point might have decided it's time to give up on this quest, right? Like, I've killed my younger brother and perhaps I should move on to a different startup idea. But not Nobel, for better or for worse. He kind of continued to labor away
most
at
people
this.
did. Most
people did. Yeah. And so there's something kind of brilliant but also deeply flawed about Nobel that's kind of at the center of this story. Like many of the protagonists in this book, there aren't any easy heroes.
Yeah.
I think it's fair to say. So he eventually does create dynamite, and he's right. It does revolutionize civil engineering all around the world. But it turns out that the very same force that he is unleashing in the world to help people dig tunnels and canals ends up having a use in the arena of political violence, because dynamite gave a kind of asymmetric power to small groups that they didn't have before. You could be a solo operator with a couple of canisters of dynamite under your jacket, and you could walk into a courthouse and blow the whole thing up. And so it set off this wave of political violence. Really, it inaugurates the birth of what we now call terrorism. Really began with dynamite. And it's one of the great tragic unintended consequences of technology, where a tool designed for one purpose that successfully does that one purpose very well ends up having an unanticipated secondary use that goes directly against the kind of wishes and vision of the original creator. And so, in a sense, one way to think about the Peace Prize, which Nobel ends up endowing after his death, is the Peace Prize was a kind of atonement for the carnage that he had unleashed in the world through the invention of dynamite.
The unintended consequences of dynamite provide a kind of natural transition, I think, Stephen, to the rise of the anarchists. And you make this transition in the book. You write,
as Alfred Nobel toiled on his floating laboratory, 1,000 miles to the east, another man with long-standing ties to St. Petersburg rode on horseback through the dense forests of larch, spruce, and pine that wind between the towering granite peaks of the Yablonov Range in southeastern Siberia.
Who is this, and why is he important to the story?
So that's Peter Kropotkin, who is, I guess I would kind of come out and say, is the figure in the book that I find the most fascinating. He was born a Russian prince. He was for a while called Prince Peter Kropotkin, although he disavowed the prince when he was a rebellious teenager, as one does. And he went on to become a pioneering geologist and geographer. He literally kind of redrew the map of Siberia from his explorations as a young man. He contributed some early key work to the understanding of how climate change affects human society over long periods of time. He was a major contributor to the debate over the social consequences of evolutionary theory, developing this wonderful concept of mutual aid, which I'm sure we'll talk about. And on top of all that, as if that wasn't enough on his CV, he is really one of the 2 or 3 main founders of the anarchist movement, of anarchist philosophy.
Right. And I love the way you describe, he's 23 years old. He's just read Charles Darwin's The Origin of Species. And he's on an expedition to discover a passage through a mountain range on the border of what's today Mongolia and China. This is back, I think, in the 1860s.
Yeah.
And on this crazy, probably life-threatening expedition across this mountain range, he decides that the survival of the fittest explanation of evolution doesn't tell the full story, right? Because he sees all these examples of what he calls, as you say, mutual aid in his journeys. Can you tell us more about that?
Yeah, it's just right at this point where Darwin has published The Origin of Species 4 years before. And there's beginning to be this kind of interpretation that goes on to endure, well into the 20th century. It goes on to endure to this very day, which is that Darwin's theory is all about the struggle for existence and about competition between species, right? And this was a view that Darwin himself didn't necessarily hold, but a lot of his disciples did. And what Kropotkin began to realize as he explored all these natural communities and even some human communities is what you actually saw much more examples of cooperation between organisms than you did competition. and that the real competition was between organisms and the environment. That particularly in Siberia, the environment was very brutal. It was very hard to make a living biologically in that kind of world. And so what again and again he would see is the ways in which organisms inside a species and between species aided each other. This is where this concept of mutual aid came about. And he also noticed it in the indigenous settlements in that part of the world, which had managed to figure out a way to live in harmony with nature without large bureaucracies, without top-down interventions, but were in this kind of stable equilibrium where they were able to survive despite the extremity of the conditions. And so this plants the seed of an idea, both an idea about evolutionary theory, but also an idea about political organization that becomes the basis of the anarchist movement. In his memoirs of this period, he says, in those days on the kind of frontier of Siberia, from that point on, I was prepared to become an anarchist.
Right. He also writes, to live with the natives, to see at work all the complex forms of social organization which they have elaborated, far away from the influences of any civilization, was, as it were, to store up floods of light which illuminated my subsequent reading.
I've always loved that line. It's such a beautiful metaphor that it was to store up floods of light to illuminate my subsequent kind of thinking and reading. That
right.
So many. You think about your own intellectual journey and things, points in your life where you were storing up floods of light that you could then illuminate things on later on. It's such a beautiful metaphor. He's a wonderful writer. So he ends up basically becoming this critical figure. He's arrested multiple times. He lives for a while in Switzerland among kind of watchmaking communities that were, in a sense, some of the first real self-named anarchist communities. He developed this idea that I think has been almost entirely forgotten in whatever lingers in the popular perception of what anarchism is, that the kind of apex of human society had been the Renaissance villages, the free cities of Europe, as he calls them, though there are also examples of this in Asia and other places around the world, kind of small communities, guild-based communities, or artisanal communities that had kind of dense urban centers with a lot of cooperation, a lot of autonomy. They weren't really beholden to large companies, corporations, which didn't really exist yet, or governments, because they were more or less free cities separate from kings and queens of that period. And he basically was like, that was the best way to live. Like that was the kind of structure of human social organization and economic organization that was best suited to us as a species in the way that we kind of naturally work together. And he was kind of looking around at what had happened in the past 30 or 40 years with the rise of industrialization in Europe and then subsequently in the United States, and was basically arguing we've made a terrible wrong turn here. We had this good kind of golden balance of mutual aid, in all these places around the world, and we're still surviving well into the 19th century. And suddenly we were seeing these factory towns and these giant corporations and these giant bureaucratic government agencies, and it was taking us away from this much more human scale kind of society that we had once had. And so anarchism was an argument that we should return to that.
Yeah, this was such a surprise to me reading your book, and I think it's probably for so many readers, right? Because most of us associate anarchism with this kind of like, some chaotic, we associate it with the dynamite, right? That was ignited by anarchists that have almost completely occluded the sort of original dream of the early anarchists. You write, there was a strangely quaint, nostalgic quality to the movement, most apparent in Kropotkin himself, a longing for a simpler, more pleasant form of life. It's true on some level, you say, that Kropotkin wanted to smash the state using whatever means was necessary. But it's also true that at his core, he wanted everyone to get to live in a modernized version of, say, 15th century Siena. Right.
Yeah.
So it's sweet.
Yeah, it's funny because, part of what happened is that the word anarchism and anarchy changed because of the dynamite. So the word is derived just from the Greek for anarchos, like no rulers. It just means a world with no rulers. It now has this association of like chaos and a negative association. Like people are rarely like, all right, yeah, more anarchy. because a movement came along and just decided to blow everything up in the name of this political philosophy, and that endowed it with these more negative capabilities. Like in the book, I say that it was arguably the worst branding campaign in the history of political ideology. Right. But at the time, that wasn't necessarily clear. And so much of the speculation in the Infernal Machine about this story and its broader political consequences was there an alternate version of the timeline where the anarchists do not embrace terrorism and really lean into that vision that Kropotkin had argued for? And is there an alternate 20th century where the leading face of the radical left is Kropotkin and not Marx? And instead of communism being represented by a very heavy centralized state apparatus and militaristic state apparatus, the alternative to corporate capitalism is the return to Renaissance villages and artisanal guilds. Like that would be a very different 20th century. Whether it would be better or not, listeners can debate. But part of what I'm trying to do for the reader of this book is to remind them that was a potential future, right? That was on the table in 1890 and in 1900 and 1910 when this book is taking place. And I think we just have forgotten about that part of our past.
This is a great segue to Emma Goldman and Alexander Berkman. And as you say, their relationship with the anarchist movement was a little different from Kropotkin's, who had kind of dreamed of this better way to live based on what he's seen in nature and the free cities of Switzerland. They had been exposed to these just horrible working conditions of early industrialization. But they're also these kinds of idealistic, love-struck bohemians that are relatable in their own way. Can you tell us about them?
Yeah, their relationship is a central through line through the book. And, one of the great joys of writing this book for me that really differs from anything else I've ever written before is in large part because Goldman wrote a very extensive autobiography, but also because of all the reporting that was available at the time. There's so much dialogue in this book. Like there's so many scenes of people in conversation, all of it obviously from the archive. I didn't invent any dialogue for this. And you really get an intimate look at the relationship between Berkman and Goldman, who kind of begin as lovers and then develop this kind of extraordinary life partnership. Berkman actually goes to jail for more than a decade after attempting to assassinate Henry Clay Frick, the first, or as he put it, proudly, the first terrorist act in American history.
Interesting.
But they end up kind of staying together as partners of some sort, intellectual partners and emotional partners, if not sexual partners, really for the rest of their lives. And so their relationship and their internal debates about the use of violence, which Goldman kind of early on seems publicly to renounce, even though privately and in some of her public statements, she's a little bit more equivocal, whereas Berkman continues to believe in the use of political violence as a way of advancing the cause. And in fact, the last third of the book, which really kind of turns into an actual kind of thriller in a way, because you have bombs going off and explosions everywhere and an undercover operation and a whole host of other things. The explosion that sets off that chain of events, Berkman, we believe, had a hand in, although it's still a little bit of a mystery. And so their evolving relationship, but they were the two most prominent anarchists in America and arguably in the world in the early part of the 20th century. So they were enormously influential figures.
And this is the little piece of the book that is, or the broader historical story that is most hard for us to understand, I think, today, which is how people who had what you describe as this kind of quaint, nostalgic belief in a simpler way to live could decide that killing innocent people was a way to advance their cause. It's very hard to fully comprehend that, right?
Yeah, I mean, I'm not excusing it, but I do try to explain how it happened. And I think that the argument that they made very consciously at the time, which is factually true, was that the industrial system, which was, again, very new, was killing far more people and maiming far more people than all of the anarchist bombs combined. We had very little kind of actual labor, occupational, workspace safety statistics back then. But every time somebody looked into it and every kind of attempt to measure how many people were, losing an arm or being blown to bits working in a steel plant or working on the railroads, which were incredibly deadly. Far more violence was basically committed in the name of industrial capitalism than was committed in the name of anarchist terrorism. And so that was their argument, was basically like, we are fighting violence with more violence. And it turned out that a much more effective strategy would be something like what Gandhi figured out about the same time period,
right,
which was it's better to fight with nonviolence.
Yes.
And they made the wrong choice in that sense. But that was the logic they used to defend themselves at the time.
And it's hard for us today to grasp how violent it was. I have a passage here from your book. A systematic survey was conducted of all the workplace accidents in Greater Pittsburgh in a 12-month period. The study found that 526 people had been killed outright on the job. 7 men lost a leg, 10 lost 2 or more fingers, 11 lost an eye, 3 or others had the sight of both eyes damaged, 2 men have crippled backs, and on and on and on. This is just in Greater Pittsburgh in 12 months, right? So people are just dying and being maimed left and right. And there's also these sort of violent responses that Rockefeller and other industrialists are having to peaceful protests, right? So there's a war of sorts going on.
And, here's one, I think, important lesson of the book, and one of the reasons why I wrote it, which is to take a step back and think about what the political landscape was at that particular moment in history, right? So every time you turn on the news or listen to anybody kind of opining on Twitter and the op-ed pages, there's this assumption that we live today in very extreme, polarized political times. And then you think about what the reality of life was in this period of American history, where the poles were on the one side, you had people who believed that the appropriate response to modern society was to get rid of both corporations and governments and return life to 15th century kind of Renaissance towns. And the other side was people who thought it was absolutely appropriate to, set a militia group on a bunch of strikers and shoot at them and burn down their tent cities because the strikers were asking to not work a 12-hour workday. Like that was the range of debate, right? And so they were literally blowing each side up and shooting at each other and assassinating leaders on all sides. And so, that was just what life was like in terms of our political conversation and our political kind of temperaments. 110 years ago, 120 years ago, so much more extreme, so much more polarized, so much more divisive than anything we see today.
A few years ago, Tony Fadell, one of the creators of the iPhone, said, "I wake up in cold sweats every so often thinking, what did we bring into this world?" Since then, he's also shared an interesting analogy. He said, the iPhone is like a refrigerator. If you're eating the wrong food, don't blame the fridge. Blame the person who puts food in the fridge. That's you. So the question is, what do you have on your iPhone? Is it healthy food or unhealthy food? As it happens, we at the Next Big Idea Club have spent the last year building an app that delivers healthy food for your brain. It's called the Next Big Idea app, and we love it. We use it every day. It's a labor of love. We select the most important new books and invite the authors, these are legendary, world-famous authors, to distill their books down to 12 minutes of audio and 4 minutes of text. We call these book bites, superfood for your brain. We publish a new one every day. A lot of media today is like processed food, regurgitated third hand. The Next Big Idea app delivers the most important new ideas, unadulterated, from the world's leading thinkers. Superfood. Our book bites are appetizers, a great way to sample new ideas. When you're ready for an entree, the Next Big Idea app also features beautiful video e-courses created from the best 8 books every year, selected by our 4 legendary curators, Adam Grant, Susan Cain, Malcolm Gladwell, and Daniel Pink. And for dessert, how about an ad-free version of this podcast? Pause this episode, click on the App Store, and search for Next Big Idea. Seriously, I don't mind waiting. See, how easy was that? If you enjoyed this podcast, you will love the app. There's no better way to get smart fast. Download the Next Big Idea app right now. So the anarchists were blowing things up, actively engaged in acts of terrorism on a regular basis, particularly in New York City. Did this directly provoke the rise of the surveillance state, of this new set of more systematic crime fighting?
Yeah, it played a big role. And that's the other kind of major theme of the book that we haven't yet talked on, that runs through the book from the very beginning. So in a way, like the story that the Infernal Machine tells is a story that comes from the convergence of kind of three main rivers, if you were, the kind of the river of dynamite, the river of anarchism, and the river of modern forensic and thinking of police work as a kind of information science. All of those three things kind of develop at the same point. All of them start in Europe, interestingly, and then kind of migrate over to the United States. And they basically kind of converge in the streets of New York between 1910 and 1920. And the kind of the heart of the book is like what happens when those three tributaries all converge in this one great city. And one of the first things that caught my attention is there was one guy named Owen Egan who was actually technically a fireman, but he worked heavily with the NYPD. And he was the guy from about 1895 until 1920 who was kind of the chief of combustibles. So if there was a bomb in the city, Owen Egan would come to either defuse it or survey the wreckage from the bomb.
What a job.
What a job. And he worked for 25 years. He died of natural causes on the job. Surprisingly,
Yeah.
he did lose
Right.
a couple of fingers defusing bombs over the years, but he did not die from an explosion. And over that period in his obituary, the Times noted that he had either inspected or defused 7,000 bombs in that period.
Astounding.
And just
7,000
think about how,
right.
like, to in one city that there were that many bombs going off. And now some of them were, it should be said, not political bombing. Some of them were, it was also a technique that the mafia used as a part of kind of their extortion. Like if you didn't pay up, they would set off a small bomb in front of your storefront and stuff like that. But part of the point was, again, thinking about, we live in such a modern, violent world. And you're like, well, what was it like living in New York City when there were 7,000 bombs going off over a 20-year period, or at least being planted? And so basically, I got really interested in what was happening at the NYPD. And basically, up until that point, they had been effectively in the service of Tammany Hall. They were corrupt. They were, in a sense, a kind of enforcement ring for a crime syndicate that was running the city. And the idea that they would be intellectuals, the idea that they would be trained detectives investigating a crime, using information management to solve a crime, using things like fingerprint technology or photography to crack a case. This was just unheard of.
And you point out that there was no dedicated detective bureau in New York City until the 1880s. In 1845, the murder rates in the city were about 5 times higher than they are today. And so the cops were thugs to a degree, beating confessions out of suspects, and as you say, a kind of controlled criminal network.
Yeah, if you've seen Gangs of New York or read Gangs of New York, this is what New York was like, and so, but this idea began to develop in Europe and in Paris with this guy Alphonse Bertillon and at Scotland Yard in Britain, that there was another way. And it was really thinking about crime fighting as an information science. One of the core things was solving the problem of identification. So I mean, this is one of these things that, you don't really think about it until you actually start to go through the history of it. But like, there were no driver's licenses, right? There were no formal government passports,
right.
And photographs and things like that, not to mention, biometrics and all the things that we take for granted now. And so in 1895 in New York, if you got arrested and people were like, "What's your name?" you could just make up a name. Like there's no way for them to tell that you were not Philip Smith, even if your name was Stephen Johnson. And certainly no way to tell whether you were the person who had been arrested a year ago on a similar crime. And so people in Europe like Bertillon and other folks began to realize, like, if there's some way to prove the identity and store the identity of people who were criminals or had been suspected of being criminals, we could get a lot better at our jobs. And so there was interest in photography, which was new. But the problem with photography is it didn't scale very well. Like if you took a picture of every suspected criminal in New York City, that could be 10,000 people very quickly. And so when someone new comes in, how do you how do you scan through 10,000 photographs to see if there's a match, right? It's not now we can do it, but you couldn't do it back then without it taking weeks and weeks and weeks. And so Bertillon realized that you could actually take measurements of people's body parts. Like you can measure the length of their index finger, you can measure the length of their left ear, you can measure these very specific things. And then you could organize those measurements into kind of nested categories so that it was in a sense a kind of search algorithm for all this data. And so you might have 10,000 suspects, but if you got the measurements for a new suspect, you could reduce the potential matches to 100 instead of 10,000, instantly. And that was and you could do the same thing with fingerprints as well, once people began to realize that fingerprints could do that. And so suddenly the core tool in the service of fighting crime was not your nightstick or your gun. It was your file cabinets, like all the information you had stored to identify these people and to figure out if this suspect had been involved before. And that really gets set in motion and becomes a key part of how the NYPD, led by these two officers, Joseph Farreau and Arthur Woods, they really reform the NYPD. They create the first bomb squad, which, by the way, was called the Bomb and Anarchist Squad because bombs and anarchy were so closely aligned. And they really go after figures like Berkman and Goldman in that period.
And they do it successfully. And we then see the rise of J. Edgar Hoover and what you describe as the weaponization of library science. What does that look like?
Yeah, there's another, I think it was an online review of the book that said this book can be summarized by librarians defeat the terrorists, which I thought was also pretty good, right? So Hoover, who obviously is a very ethically complex figure who goes on to do a lot of dastardly things at the helm of the FBI over the 20th century, over the 50 years that he was in charge of the FBI. But he began his career moonlighting at the Library of Congress as a teenager in D.C. There, he learned about these new file systems, basically, that have been invented, new ways of categorizing books so that you could find the information you were looking for, just like Bertillon had figured out how to organize, fingerprint collections or biometric collections. And so when he began working for the Justice Department early on, the first thing he was really assigned to do around 1917, 1918 was to head up this division that was basically, in pursuit of initially kind of German nationals during World War I who were in the United States, and then the radicals. And he was appointed as the head of this new division called the Radical Division. And their job was largely to strike out against the anarchist threat. And he realized at the Justice Department that their information systems were just atrocious and was just incredibly disorganized. And, their file cabinets were way behind the times. They weren't nearly as advanced as the Library of Congress. And so he instituted this new system of information management. Sometimes it's called the editorial file system. And it was kind of like a relational database. Basically, like you would have an entry for a person who was a suspect. They would be connected to publications they had written for and events that they had spoken at and organizations that they were tied to. And even though they didn't have anything resembling computers, it was much easier to kind of pull all the threads together when you were working a case once Hoover had instituted this system. And the first people that he directed the full force of this system against were Alexander Berkman and Emma Goldman. And he got it in his head that he could deport those two along with a bunch of other anarchists using these new information management systems. And that is kind of, I probably shouldn't give away too much more about it, but for people who want to read the book, but that leads to the final stretch of the book, was this kind of battle, not just between the NYPD, but this new national version of this crime fighting as an information science, which is what they really set in place. And so what this ultimately does, the other tragic unintended arc that's at the center of this book, just like Nobel and his dynamite that we began with, is the anarchists dreaming of a stateless society, dreaming of a return to this much more egalitarian mutual aid world, end up through their actions creating the modern FBI and the modern system of state surveillance that becomes dominant in the 20th century and is still around us to this day. And so it is the very antithesis of what they were trying to do.
Right. Talk about unintended consequences. Right.
Yeah.
But I think it's the kind of story that no one else would write as you have, right? I mean, 'cause there is a very specific.
I assume you mean that as a compliment.
Yes, indeed, I do. I mean, I think I think the protagonists of your stories are both technologies and ideas and movements, and in addition to colorful individuals, right? And you kind of give them equal weight in a way that is unusual, and I think somewhat reflective of your kind of view of how history happens, how our reality unfurls, right? I mean, to me, there's a larger project here. Even though you can look at your many books, 14 books now, and they kind of fall into two categories. They're narrative histories, and then they're books about science and innovation. But they have a commonality, which is they're both focused on the many unseen forces that drive history. Do you see yourself as having kind of a larger project here?
That's very nice of you to say, and it's observant, I think. So it's always fun as a writer to hear people pick up on those larger themes over the body of the work that you do. I think there are kind of 2 or 3 projects at work. One of them is that I'm just very interested in transitions and paradigm shifts, like what happens when society shifts from one mode to another. And that can be a scientific paradigm shift, that can be an economic one, that can be an institutional change, technological, and there are a couple that are at work in the Infernal Machine. Obviously, the rise of information science and policing and the demise of anarchism and industrialization and, all those things that we've talked about are all at work. And so trying to understand when big changes happen in society, like what is really happening. And so when I write history, I write in the mode, obviously, of trying to explain what happened, but I'm always interested in why it happened and trying to explain like what were the deeper forces. And sometimes those forces are individual people and the force of their personality and their genius or their villainous properties, whatever it is. But a lot of times it's kind of larger than individual people. So it's technological changes or changes in the way that we use energy in the case of dynamite, or changes in how capital is deployed, or scientific breakthroughs and so on. And so I'm always trying to do that kind of the why. And what I've tried to do with these history books, and this is more the kind of narrative art of it, is to figure out a way so that you can write a book that is explanatory on one hand, like it explains why these events happened and connects them and shows you a kind of a vision of the forces that came together to make these things possible and help invent the world that you now live in. But to do that through a true, hopefully page-turning narrative.
Right. And I think it seems to me that there's a thesis that you have perhaps about the nature of history, the nature of our reality that comes out. And one way I think of it is having been friends for years, of course, I know about you that you enjoy complexity. In fact, you have a music playlist that you've shared with some friends that's called Complex Songs. Right. It's a beautiful playlist that I love with, I think, Bon Iver and Sufjan Stevens, maybe Vampire Weekend. So I feel like part of your kind of thesis about sort of our reality and the way that history happens is that it's more complex than it appears to be on the surface. Is that fair?
Yeah, and part of that complexity is, in a sense, a kind of multidisciplinary quality to it, so that to understand why something happened, to understand like how did Hoover come to dominate the FBI and this kind of mode of state surveillance come into being. To answer that question, it's not sufficient to just tell the story of J. Edgar Hoover's life. For me, interested as I am in complexity and in a sense in networks, right? Networks of cause and effect, and multidisciplinary networks of cause and effect. To me, it's like, well, this story also involves the invention of dynamite, which is a story really about chemistry and, kind of industrial capitalism. And it also involves the political philosophy of anarchism. And it also involves these breakthroughs in forensic science. And it also, it involves all these different things. And if you really want to do the justice to the story, if you really want to know what happened, you have to figure out a way to weave all those things together. And so the challenge as a writer is, what is the maximum amount of complexity that you can fit into the book? I mean, this is something we've talked about in the past too, which is like, you can also say, well, if I'm going to tell the true story, I have to start with the Big Bang. like none of this would have been possible without the Big Bang, and I have to talk about the evolution of all life on Earth, and I have to talk about, and most of us would agree for this kind of story, if you're trying to write a sweeping history of life, the universe, and everything, like then, it is appropriate to start with the Big Bang, but, or Sapiens or something like that. You might want to go back 10,000 years. But in this case, no, I think the appropriate place to start was probably Kropotkin and Nobel in the early 1860s, exploring their new terrain. That felt like the right place to start. But that's the process. Like as an author, is like, how do you manage that desire to complexify with the reader's tendency to want to figure out like what the heck is going on with the story?
Here's another inference I would offer about what I suspect is sort of your view of history, Stephen. I think you see pivotal moments in history as much more fragile than most people assume. Right? When we look back at the past, there's a kind of solidity to it, right? The past feels sort of solid and determined. But in fact, when you look back at these moments in history, they were often truly perilous and just hanging by a thread. And this is true of some of the descriptions you have in Infernal Machine. They're alternate versions of history that were actually much more possible than we might think from our vantage today.
So there's kind of two ways in which that I think that's really interesting to think about. So first, there is this kind of genre of alternate histories that seemingly are kind of becoming more popular. So there's Philip Roth's The Plot Against America, which was turned into a show. And there's the big Apple TV show For All Mankind, which basically starts with the idea that the Russians land on the moon first. If you flip that one bit, what would then be the chain of events that happened after that? And it's a very useful way of, it's a wonderful kind of thought experiment. That's all it can ever be, right? You can't actually rerun the tape of history. But I think playing those thought experiments out helps you get to really the second point that I wanted to raise, which is to remind yourself that at these moments, it gives you a sense of what was at stake in the past, right? That like, you're not just like, these are the events that happened, but they could have gone some other way. And had it not worked out, like, wow, your whole life might be different. And the people who were fighting and arguing and innovating and trying to change the world at that moment in the past could have led us in a different direction. And they fought the way that they did, or they, worked the way that they did because they knew they had the opportunity to change the course of future history. And they were right. And it ended up with the history that we have, but it could have gone another way. And I think part of that is, it's a good thing to keep in your mind as you live in the present tense, right? That like you yourself are making choices and participating in things in the world that will alter the downstream course of events, from here on out. And, there are still stakes that are, up for grabs, or consequences or future histories that are changeable depending on what we do now.
Another theme I picked up in your books is looking at the history of innovation. Is it generally true that most inventions would have happened without specific individuals? Would we have had dynamite without Alfred Nobel? I mean, we like to say casually, without Thomas Edison, we wouldn't have light bulbs, but this is probably not the case, right?
It's a big debate. I think, there is a long tradition, if you look at the history of innovation, of what is called simultaneous discovery, where people working across the world in completely disconnected labs or in private investigations discover or invent basically the same technology within months of each other. And the reason of this is that at various points in the history of technology, certain ideas become imaginable or actionable because of other developments in the history of ideas and science and technology. And you cannot invent an electric light bulb in 1700. It's just there isn't the conceptual, technical, scientific materials available to you to do it. But suddenly, by about 1865, 1870, the building blocks were there. And given enough people, given a culture that rewards innovation, someone will invent a light bulb at that point. And so there are certain kinds of innovations that seem to follow this interesting, inevitable logic. There's no version of the world, if you played alternate histories like 10 times, where the microwave oven gets invented in 1600 and the personal computer gets invented in 600 BC. Like that, it can't happen. There might be slight variations. One thing might come, before the other. And there's some funny things like the typewriter is invented quite late. Like the typewriter isn't invented into the 1860s, but technically it could have been invented. The bicycle is invented kind of late.
Yes,
but in general,
and so was putting wheels on luggage came way too late.
That's the classic example. Like, why did they not think of this, right? So, but in general, it seems to kind of follow this thing. But I think there are other outliers like dynamite where the field of potential innovators was so heavily reduced by this other competing incentive of not wanting to die.
Right.
And so
and sometimes it's these sort of mavericks, right? Like an Alfred Nobel. You need somebody who's a little bit nutty and insanely driven and risk tolerant, right, to push through the resistance.
I suppose, it's a great question because I haven't actually thought about it. I didn't pose this in the book, actually, but it's a good alternate experiment. I could imagine very, very easily a world where we don't have dynamite until 1900 instead of 1865. And how does the industrialization and urbanization of the world look without dynamite for those 35 years? That's an interesting little thought experiment to run.
Yeah. Do you see, Stephen, trends in tech innovation? Martin Luther King famously said, the arc of the moral universe bends towards justice. In what direction does the arc of tech innovation bend?
I don't know if it really bends, if it bends in a coherent direction. I'm not even sure if the arc of history bends towards justice. I wish it's a beautiful, it's a beautiful line, but who knows?
We're all cheerleading for MLK's assertion there.
But I think the closest principle I would say that is at least central to this book is increasing amounts of power and information in the hands of smaller and smaller groups of people. So that was the pattern of dynamite for sure, is that suddenly, one person could blow up a building with something that they could fit in their pocket. And the same kind of situation with information, one person with the right file cabinet system could manage and explore, huge amounts of information that would have taken a vast team before that if the information hadn't been organized properly. And so there's that is a kind of a, what they really call it, like a secular trend or long-term trend in technology. Now there are other ones, and sometimes they go back and forth, but I think that that's as close to a way that the arc bends as anything else I can think of.
Yes. I was that was what I was lobbing you a softball. I thought you were heading in that direction.
Good. I need everything I can get.
The LinkedIn Podcast Network is sponsored by TIAA. In the last 100 years, we've seen financial markets swing, new currencies come and go, decades of savings lost in days, all showing that a retirement plan without a guarantee, quite simply, isn't enough. So more than a retirement plan, TIAA makes you a retirement promise. A promise of a guaranteed retirement paycheck for life. A promise that pays off. Learn more at TIAA.org/promisespayoff.
At Airbnb, we know preserving the places we love takes fair regulations. It's why we support collecting tourism taxes on behalf of our hosts that can help fund critical public services, reasonable host registration requirements, and policies that promote neighborhood safety, like banning parties. Together, we can preserve what we love about where we live.
Your interest in complicated storytelling dovetails with your interest in more sophisticated ways of organizing information with digital tools. This has been an interest of yours ever since we were in college together, when you were obsessed with HyperCard and later other technologies for writing like Scrivener and others. You've been interested in kind of new ways that technology can help writers tell more complex stories or organize more kind of networked thoughts, I guess you might say. You're now engaged in a new project that is really bringing to fruition this long-held interest. You want to tell us something about that?
Yeah, as you said, I mean, it's just from the very beginnings of when I was in college, I got a Mac. We're dating ourselves here, but we arrived in college in 1986, and I got a Mac that year, and I kind of fell in love with the Mac. And then this program HyperCard came out, which was very obscure now. Most people have forgotten about it, but it was kind of a glimpse of the future of hypertext before the web had even really been invented at that point. This is 86, 87. And I got obsessed with this idea, like I could use this machine and software to help me organize my ideas and my notes for my classes. And so I built a little application inside of HyperCard that was all about keeping I called it curriculum. It was all about keeping my notes from my classes. And I got so obsessed with it that I stopped going to my classes. So it kind of was a self-defeating invention. But that just planted this seed. It stored up floods of light that I would later use to illuminate the rest of to quote Peter Kropotkin. So as you said, I went through a bunch of different wonderful tools over the years. I started collecting all the quotes from books that I read for research in digital form so that I could search them initially. So I have the most important passages from books that I've read dating back to around 1999. It's something like 8,000 passages now. I have them on my computer, but now I have them stored in this new project that I've been working on now almost for 2 years now with Google. And it's called Notebook LM. And it's our attempt to build really this dream that I've been chasing for, my entire adult life, certainly my professional life, of the ideal kind of research and writing tool now made possible finally at long last by the new language models like ChatGPT and in Google's case, Gemini. So we've been developing this tool, and basically I can put in my entire reading history, all those quotes, something like 2 million words of quotes from books. And the second I kind of upload all those quotes, the model is effectively an expert in all that information. And I can say things like, what are some examples of unanticipated consequences in technological history? And it will give me this wonderful kind of crafted, detailed answer with footnotes, like citations directly to the original passages, based specifically on my sources, like not based on the general training data that the model has, not, which is prone to hallucinations and all these other problems, but based on the information that I've given it. And I now am able to use it, and I used it in part we were developing it as I was writing Infernal Machine. I'm now able to use it as a real collaborator with what I'm doing and an extension of my memory. And so my ability to kind of go in and be like, hey, I just wrote this sentence. What other ideas from the last 25 years of the books that I've read would be relevant to this sentence that I just wrote, or this paragraph I'm working on, or this sketch I have for an article? And Notebook LM is just extremely good at synthesizing, making connections. It's really fundamentally a kind of a summarization tool in a way, and a synthesizing tool. It's not pretending to be my buddy. It's not like, it doesn't have a personality, which I love. I just want it to help me organize and connect across all this information. So that's the way we've designed it. And it's just been an amazing journey to get to build this thing that I've been chasing for my whole life.
It's so incredible. And it really is, talk about sort of unlikely narrative developments, right?
Yes.
I mean, you've been maintaining a Spark file and talking about slow hunches and the value of writing down your thoughts that may not connect with other ideas, but may find a home in the future. You've had a thesis about you've been collecting favorite passages from books for decades. And I now have to, I have been engaged ever since I've begun to have visibility into what AI is making possible in terms of the ability to organize and summon and assist the writing process and even the thinking process, right? With access to all this information that is particularly powerful for us. That it seems to me that one of the effects of this is that we all need to be collecting thoughts and highlighting favorite passages from things that we read, right? I mean that it actually, like, the dividends that are generated from those habits have just become much, much more greater.
Yeah, and what's amazing about it is when I first started working on this project, it was kind of like, oh, this is going to be incredible search, right? I'm going to be able to do a natural language search and be like, hey, what was the name of that cafe where Berkman and Goldman first met? And it was going to be able to understand my question and generate, tell me that it was Saks Cafe in the Lower East Side. But now, as the models have gotten so much more advanced, I'm using it in a very different way. So one of the things I was starting to do, I'm trying to figure out like what the next history book is going to be. And so one thought I had, which I'm still not sure about, but like one thought I had was that maybe there's some kind of book I could write that was centered around the gold rush in California. And so I read this wonderful book called The Age of Gold, I think it was, that came out about 25 years ago, and highlight a bunch of quotes from that book. And then I loaded them into Notebook LM, which you can do because Notebook does not train the model on your data. So anything that you have that's personal or that you are reading under copyright that you have the rights to because you bought the book, you can put into the model because we're just kind of putting that information into the short-term memory of the model, but there's no way that will become part of the model's overarching training data and be used by anybody else. So that's a very important part of the project. So I put these quotes in there and I'm like, I basically wrote a little query that was basically like, hi, I'm Stephen Johnson. I write multi-threaded, complex network narrative history books like The Ghost Map and The Enemy of All Mankind. I'm thinking about writing a book about the gold rush in that style. Take a look at these quotes that I've just given you. And what do you think? Like, what themes or potential narratives do you see that might be interesting? And it really generates like some very interesting, provocative ideas, in a sense, kind of taking my human intelligence of describing what I'm looking for and the kind of book I want to write, the intelligence of the author who wrote this wonderful book about the gold rush and their insights, and its ability to kind of go through all these passages and, based on its own other outside knowledge of the world, to kind of synthesize and suggest things, and also suggest very specific quotes that I could go back to and use in different ways and stuff like that. And so it really does feel like the beginnings of an intellectual collaboration where the model and I are working together on a project, and we think in different ways. I mean, like, one of the great lessons, and you've talked about this a lot on this podcast with other guests, is, when people with different kinds of intelligence converge on a problem, they tend to be better problem solvers because they complement each other and build on each other, and they approach it from different angles. And that is what we're going to start getting now, what we are getting now with these language models and other forms of AI. They aren't human. They aren't intelligent in the way that humans are, but they have already some superhuman skills at summarization and association and other things like that. And so when you work in sync with them, and particularly when you ground the model in documents and sources that you trust, I think that magical things can happen now already right out of the gate. I mean, we see them, every day with Notebook LM.
Can you talk a little bit, Stephen, about how you think about hunches, slow hunches, fast hunches, and clusters of hunches, and how that intersects with Notebook LM and how people can deploy AI?
Yeah, and where good ideas come from, the book I wrote now 14 years ago, one of the opening chapters is a riff about the kind of the illusion of the eureka moment, the light bulb moment that dominates so much of the discussion of innovation and history of ideas. Everybody loves to tell a story where the apple falls from the tree and he has the theory of gravity. There's like this moment of sudden discovery because that makes for a good story. But the truth is, if you go back and look at the history of innovation, that it almost never really happens like that. And the way that it normally happens is that somebody has a hunch, like a sense of possibility, a sense that there's something interesting or puzzling in some field or domain or some business opportunity or whatever it is, creative idea. And they don't really have it in an actionable way or a fully realized way, but there's just a like spidey sense kind of that there's something interesting. And it often stays in that hunch state for months, for years. There are some examples of it that I've written about that is like more than a decade of kind of lingering in the back of your mind. And slowly what happens is the hunch, you see something else, or you read something else, or you have a conversation with someone else, and they add a little bit more. It's like it's a network that's slowly building out. It's not a single thing. And over time, as you make more connections, the hunch starts to feel like maybe there's something there. And eventually you think, well, actually, I have a book here, or I have an invention here, or I have a startup here. And so part of the lesson is, which you alluded to before, is to write everything down, or type everything up, whatever preposition you want, and capture those hunches, because they are the easiest things to forget. Like first thing everybody has so many things to do, and you've got to manage the kids, or you've got Q1 deliverables at your job, or whatever it is. And so that weird little fragment of an idea that you had like while shaving doesn't linger, really easily. And it's easy to just have it get wiped out of your mind because it's not useful yet. But that hunch that you had, while shaving in 2018 might actually be the seed of a great idea in 2024, because something has changed in the world, or your knowledge has changed, or the network you're in has changed. And so I've always tried to really be rigorous about like writing those down, revisiting them, like kind of reading. This is what I call the spark file that you alluded to, just like having the place where you just jot down the kind of crazy ideas. And, when I read through my spark file, like easily a fifth of them, I'm like, how many glasses of wine had I had that night when I wrote that? Like, what does that even mean? But then, every 30 of them, I'm like, that became a book. Like that was the night where I first started to think about the thing that became a book. And so that, I think it's a wonderful practice. And by the way, you can do that pen and paper with a notepad, but I think that it's now, the payoff of being able to have it in your notebook, in Notebook LM or whatever note-taking software you use, because now not only can you search it, but now the AI can help you kind of riff on those ideas and make its own connections. I think the payoff of that is so valuable.
Well, this may make the writing of your next book that much easier, and it may result in more beautiful, complicated tellings of interesting historical moments. So thank you, Stephen, for being with us today. I gathered some light, which I'm going to store.
Thank you.
So many interesting topics here. And,
it was wonderful. A total delight, Rufus. Thank you for having me back.
Stephen Johnson's new book, The Infernal Machine, is out now. If you're not a follower of Stephen's Substack, Adjacent Possible, I think you'll enjoy it. If you like this conversation, you'll probably enjoy Stephen's previous appearances on this show, of which there are many. He has the distinction of being our most frequent guest. You can find links to those episodes in the show notes. Last year, we partnered with Stephen to create a short-form audiobook called Immortality, A User's Guide. It's about the promise and perils of radical life extension. You can buy a copy on Audible or listen by downloading the Next Big Idea Club app. Oh, and if you want to play around with Notebook LM, just go to notebooklm.google. Today's episode was produced by Caleb Bissinger, sound design by Mike Toda. The Next Big Idea is a proud member of the LinkedIn Podcast Network. I'm Rufus Griscom. See you next week.